Hi, I'm Bobby Halton, and welcome to the National Fireman's Journal podcast. I'm very grateful for my three guests today, all of whom have very important things to get to, but have taken the time today to talk a little bit about firefighter cancer, and in particular, PFOAs, PFASs, these long chain Cs, the things that are being put into our gear and such at this point in time, and how they may affect us in terms of firefighters and cancer. We're going to talk a little bit about the cohort study, and we're going to talk a little bit about the biological effects and what we know is happening in that arena, and research that has been done and research that's coming. So very grateful to be joined. I'm wearing glasses today to make myself look smarter because I am definitely the dumbest guy in the room. Um, I'm surrounded by real doctors and people with PhDs and many other credentials. So I apologize in advance. I'm not going to give you their full CVs because with these three folks, it would go on for days. These are truly academic and intellectual giants who have been kind enough to lend their talents to the American Fire Service, to the Fire Service internationally, to try to improve our health and wellness. So with us is Miriam Calkins. She's PhD and an MS from the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, the CDC folks, and she's with the Division of Field Studies and Engineering Field Research Branch with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And her most notable recent activities for us has been with the Firefighter Cohort study, which we'll get to in a moment. We have Dr. Jeff Burgess, who is a real doc, an MD, as well as an MS and a bio-researcher. He's the Associate Dean for Research, and he's a professor at the University of Arizona at the Mel Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health. And then Dr. Graham Peaslee, and Dr. Peaslee is a professor at Notre Dame in experimental nuclear physics. And he has been looking at these PFOAs and PFOSs in our gear and in our foam for quite some time, and he's been speaking around the country about, the EPA efforts with water and in our gear. And we wanted to have a conversation today, a brief conversation for your podcast enjoyment, and about what are these things exactly, where are they, what is the threat, and what should we be concerned about. So I guess we'll start with Dr. Peaslee. If you could explain what exactly are these chemicals that we're calling PFOAs and PFOSs before we talk about the firefighter cohort study.
Okay, this will be really brief, Bobby. Thanks for the invitation. The PFAS is a class of chemicals, and these are called per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, and that's the general term that everybody prefers to use. They used to be called PFCs, and it refers to a type of surfactant that we've made chemically for decades now, since the 1940s originally, and they are used everywhere for waterproofing, durable water resistance, for stain resistance in carpets. They're used in commercial products, they're used in industrial processes, and of course they're used in AFFF, any sort of firefighting, Class B firefighting foams for petrochemicals. And so these are good chemicals. They're very good at what they do. They separate water from non-water, and they are unfortunately persistent, so they last forever. Nothing naturally eats them or biodegrades them, of the short chain variety anyway. The long chain variety can break down a little bit, but it is persistent, it's bioaccumulative, it shows up in the ecosystems and in polar bears and things like that. And it's also now, we've got several demonstrated toxicities with these. Not everyone has been measured, of course, but the several we've looked at has got demonstrated human toxicity. So that's the concern, that these chemicals are in everything we touch, and especially in the service of the fire services, we see it in several places.
So doctor, on that same topic, most things break down over time. Mm-hmm. Not these.
Not these. These are manufactured, all of them are anthropogenic. They're all man-made, and they're built to last. They're a carbon-fluorine bond, which doesn't break down naturally. There's very few organisms that could even ingest that, let alone break it down. Most of it would will sit there for hundreds of thousands of years before it breaks down in a natural environment.
So that wasn't a joke when you said it's in polar bears and it's in remote animals, because the bears eat the fish eat the birds. So
That's correct. And so they don't have a lot of gear that they're wearing in the polar bears, but what they do is it bioaccumulates at the smaller animals, the larger animals, and it's a global pollutant. It's going to the North and South Pole, whereas we look at those fauna from the North and South Poles to do a diagnosis of these persistent organic pollutants, and these are now well known to be one of the most persistent, and they're a threat to both ecosystems and now to human health.
and the other term that you used, I think, is important for firefighters, men and women like me, who are not PhDs. You said they're bioaccumulative, so they attract themselves like within your body, or what does that mean?
They persist. They don't come out of the body quickly, but more importantly, they can both biomagnify and bioaccumulate, which means they can be eaten by larger organisms from smaller. You can get it from eating leafy greens. You can absorb some from the plant to you. You can have a smaller animal be eaten by a larger animal and accumulate that way. And it also magnifies as the organism gets older. There's more in it. To extent, all of these show some of those properties and at different levels.
Wow, wow. I'd like to bring in Miriam, if you don't mind, and talk about very quickly the cohort study, firefighter cancer. A lot of my peers, Dr. Daniels did a great report, very lengthy. We kind of understand the summary, but you put together a great project with many of your colleagues that we're very familiar with, and thank you for doing that. Can you tell us, we all know about smoke, and we're kind of wrapping our head around that even today. And I'm old, I can say it. I've got 2 pensions and a bad attitude. We're still not doing enough to prevent ourselves from smoke. And now we're talking about, much like COVID-19, something we can't see, we can't smell, that potentially can make us very, very ill, can kill us. So could you tell us a little bit about the study and what you did there and what you're doing going forward about firefighter cancer, and how maybe this is going to, this issue, fluorinated compounds, is going to tie into it?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Just to test.
Perfect, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I do want to give credit where credit is due, because this study actually, I think, was thought up by Dr. Burgess, who is also on the phone. So I jumped into it midstream, took over for Dr. Kenny Fent, also at NIOSH, as he stepped aside to lead the National Firefighter Registry. So my involvement is newer with the firefighter cancer cohort study, but I can provide a quick background. And then Jeff, please feel free to jump in if there's anything I missed. But basically, the firefighter cancer cohort study, or the FFCCS, is a partnership between the universities of Arizona, University of Miami, CDC NIOSH, and then several firefighter organizations and the fire service, including fire chiefs, captains, and firefighters from numerous departments. It's a prospective study, which basically means that we are enrolling people in the study, then following them for the next, hopefully, 30 years. That's the goal. And it includes an exposure assessment, as well as assessments for various health outcomes, mostly epigenetic changes that impact the risk of cancer, which is really Jeff's wheelhouse, and I'll let him touch on that. And then also some very extensive survey tools that are mostly led by the University of Miami. And we're collecting information from firefighters, not only in structural firefighting, but also in fire training scenarios, in arson investigations, from our firefighters, the aircraft rescue firefighting firefighters, and a number of other settings. So we're trying to get a really good kind of capture the whole firefighting industry as best we can with this one cohort study. So we're in our 4th year, and there's a couple of different ongoing parts of it. We're piecing it together with different individual grants that each run for about 3 years typically. And NIOSH's involvement is mostly in the exposure assessment, so that's what I can speak to most directly. And I do, before going forward, want to note that there are other exposure assessments that have to do with PFAS that are led by other CDC agencies. So the work that we'll be discussing as part of the firefighter cancer cohort study and what NIOSH is leading. Oh no.
You're fine. Your audio is
still. Oh, I'm still there.
Yep.
My Zoom disappeared, so I'm still on the phone, but
It's a great
okay.
picture of you, and we can still hear you fine. So we'll just continue along. I think Zoom will catch up to us. You used a couple of
Okay.
terms. Used a couple of terms though that I want to try to clear up, and obviously I should have asked you first of all, what is a cohort? What is epigenetics? Because hey, I'm just a firefighter.
Absolutely.
And then so just fill those in real quick for us.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's all right.
So a cohort is basically just a group. It's a fancy way to describe a group of people that we have enrolled and put together, and then you can kind of think of it as like your research family. So you're put together as a participant into this larger group of multiple participants, and that makes up your cohort, and then that group is followed forward. So it's a fancy name, a research name for a group, basically. And then epigenetics, actually, if you want to loop Jeff in, I think Dr. Burgess can speak on that better while hopefully my Zoom catches up over here, if you don't mind.
Please, Doc.
Sure. So Miriam did a great job describing the cohort study. And just before I talk about epigenetics, I would just like to point out that the studies done by Doug Daniels and others at NIOSH and other epidemiologic studies, so that's looking at disease in populations, specifically in this case, cancer in firefighters, are looking at cancer now. So those exposures occurred many years ago. So there's what probably a lot of you heard is the latency period between exposure and onset of cancer. That can be anywhere between 3 years for some types of leukemia to well over 30 years for certain types of lung cancer. So the cancers we're seeing now are the result of exposures that occurred years ago. What we don't know is the effect of the exposures we're getting nowadays. We have a lot more synthetics, that are burning in houses. So the fires aren't the same as they were years ago. And so we need to know what's going on now before cancer occurs. And we also, if we're going to be putting interventions in place as we are, and that's part of the cohort study, is to study interventions so that we're not just waiting for cancer to happen, we're trying to prevent it. So we want something that we can see changing that's an effect of these exposures before cancer. So it's on that pathway between exposure and cancer, but hopefully at a point where it can still be reversed. And what we've chosen to look at initially are epigenetic changes. Realize that we save blood in a repository so we can go back and look at all sorts of other markers later on, should they become important. But we're focusing right now on epigenetics, and epigenetic changes are things that affect gene expression, but don't change the DNA sequence. If they change the DNA sequence, that'd be a genetic change. Epigenetic is anything that affects gene expression that is not changing the DNA sequence. An epigenetic change is like a light switch. You can turn it on for gene expression, or you can turn it off. There's things that are called oncogenes that increase your risk of cancer. If you turn on an oncogene, you're going to increase your risk of cancer. There are things called tumor suppressor genes that suppress cancer. If you turn off a tumor suppressor gene, you're going to increase your risk of cancer. And what we found so far is comparing incumbent firefighters, who generally have had about 10 or more years of firefighting experience, to new recruits who've never seen a fire before, at least from an occupational sense. We are seeing increases in the oncogene or the oncogenic epigenetic changes that increase your risk of cancer. And we're seeing a reduction in the tumor suppressor epigenetic changes. So those are all increasing the risk of cancer, and some preliminary work we're doing, that's all been published, it's out there, and some preliminary work we've been doing shows that we're seeing these changes even within the first 2 years of firefighting. And it appears, at least so far, although we're not completely done, to be associated more with structural fires than any other type of fire.
Well, that would in fact make sense, because the structural fires is where most of these compounds are. Not to diminish the toxicity of wood burning and other things, because there is toxicity, and getting overwhelmed by even a forest fire smoke will kill you. But obviously the smoke from open cell foam and fluorinated compounds, PVC pipe, and everything else that's in a home, that's a really toxic mix. So thank you for doing that. And I like the light switch idea. So there are these two switches that we know firefighting causes these two switches. The one that blocks tumors gets turned off, and the one that turns on that acceptance of cancer gets turned on. So you've got two switches going in the wrong way because of our chosen profession. And I find that to be terrifying, but nonetheless, we all understand risk. No firefighter went into this business thinking it was risk-free. It's not, and we get that. But the goal should be to minimize every risk as much as possible. So the work that you all are doing for us is identifying some of those risks and saying, hey, these are things that you can avoid. Avoid them, right? Don't breathe smoke. We've been saying that forever. And anybody who's listening to this and thinks that they can't wear their SCBA to go up on a roof because it affects their balance, well, get cancer and see what that does to your balance. So, you gotta be smarter. The other thing that I think is important, and Doc Burgess just mentioned, is all the proliferation of all these modern products were not made by Snidely Whiplash thinking he was gonna, kill people. It was all done with the best of intentions to make life better and all that. But many times these people postulated these things as being absolutely safe as you could drink it like milk, or it's like soap. It's like ivory soap. That's what I was told about foam when I was a youngster. And I was one of those guys who threw foam everywhere, and we waded through it. I don't think I ever cleaned my gear after using it. I might not even taken a shower because I thought I was hanging out in soap. And now we know it was full of terrible product. And we had an Air Force base right near my fire department. We co-responded. So I trained with all the AFFF and the Class B a lot. And now we know that the drinking water near these Air Force bases, that's where this emphasis on fluorinated compounds kind of got started, which is one of those things that Dr. Burgess was just talking about, that our industry is constantly exposing ourselves to, which brings us up into where we currently are. I can't emphasize enough, don't breathe smoke, don't breathe diesel smoke, don't touch your attachments to your tailpipes with bare hands, use gloves. If you think getting cancer is going to make you popular, you're a moron. Go join the police department because we don't need you. We have to stop exposing ourselves, which brings us up to this whole PFOA and PFAS and the fluorinated compounds, and the conversations that we've been having are all over the place. And so, we hear stories, and I'm going to bring in Dr. Graham back in, if he wouldn't mind talking to us now about what he's been doing, because I heard that it's not in our gear anymore, and that they stopped putting in the gear in 2014. And I'm just going to be honest, there's a lot of men and women out there with gear older than 2014. A lot of us. Gear's expensive stuff. And if you can get 10, 15 years out of it, especially if you're volunteering, you're going to. And even if you're a career guy like I was, you hang on to your old gear. I don't know why we hang on to it. I'm not really sure why. I don't know. We do. And we launder it, but I don't know, in this case, if that's enough. So Dr. Graham, tell us what you're doing with Graham, Dr. Peaslee. Tell us what you're doing in terms of studying our gear now, and what you're seeing and what you're researching. And then maybe Dr. Burgess and Dr. Calkins wouldn't mind chiming in on how what they're doing is being supported and enhanced by what you're doing.
Thank you, Bobby. I think the first thing we should say is that what I'm doing is just an independent study on some gear sent by some retired and active service firefighters. And I don't have the resources to do the type of studies that should be done by Jeff and his cohort studies and the CDC and people like that, NIOSH particularly. And we're encouraging them to get funding to do this because I think it's an important route. But I think the important part is it's just we made an observation. I didn't know about, I knew about the AFFF situation. Everybody's heard about that for years now. And there has been a change from C8 foams to C6 foams about 5 years ago. And every municipal fire department has been changing to the newer, greener, safer foams. But this is really just a change of the type of chemical. It's still a PFAS. And in fact, it's probably what we're going to say is a regrettable substitution some year, because the C6 foams are more water soluble. They get further. They are more easily absorbed. They do leave your body quicker sometimes. It's a little arguable on sulfonates, but it is certainly shorter chains will stay in your body less often. But if you're going to drink it every day, it doesn't really matter how quickly it leaves. It's going to build up. And the same argument would apply if there were other sources of exposure. And I found out from a firefighter, or firefighter's spouse in this case, that the gear is made heavily to be water resistant for good purpose. You don't want to carry heavy gear up a ladder. And the fire safety aspects of it is undeniable. You've got to wear your PPE. But keeping it dry has fallen to the role of these PFAS. They put it into the gear, and they used it as many textiles, as an outer coating as well as an inner moisture barrier, and PFAS is used in both. Now, is it safe since the PFOA has been phased out of the production of Teflon? It's safer, perhaps. It is not got PFOA in the inner moisture barrier anymore. That's true. The outer barrier, however, is never made with PFOA. It's made with all sorts of side chain fluoropolymers. And our research showed that the jackets we looked at, manufactured much later, 2017, were all still being made with methacrylates that decay into PFOA, which is the stuff they don't have in there, of course. Well, it wasn't really in there. It was a precursor that turned into PFOA with degradation. And so the story that this is safer because it's short chain is one that I'm concerned with. I don't think we have any proof that it's safer, and there's some evidence that if you're continually exposed to it, I'm sorry, if you put on a jacket and you're peeing out one of these compounds the next morning, I'm not sure that's safer. And even though the toxicity of the short chains is certainly less, the human toxicity, but it's one of those things. It's a combination of exposure and toxicity. And do we need all this gear to be as highly water resistant as do? And it's possible to meet NFPA standards with a treatment that isn't fluorinated. And why don't we have that as an option if we're trying to reduce our exposure to these types of chemicals? I think clearly most firefighters are getting it from what they drink and eat, and that's going to be from drinking the water contaminated with AFFF or eating the food that's been contacted from their gear or their hands, or accidental dust ingestion from hand to mouth. But I think if there was a secondary exposure, and we don't know that it's there yet, we just know that this gear has the potential to shed, and that's what my research showed. It sheds prolifically, and therefore it's in dust. Could that be an exposure route, or could it go through the skin? Neither of which we know yet, but people are working on that. And I think the idea is, as you said, to reduce risk. Are there procedures we could put in place now to minimize exposure without, making sure that fire safety is still there? You still have to wear your gear, but maybe you don't have to wear your gear when you're doing workout. Maybe you can wear it the library runs. You don't need the gear on. When you're going to a call, you want the gear on, of course, but there are different ways of keeping yourself segregated from the gear off daddy. So those are the sorts of things that we reported on, and I think it's up to the medical community and, of course, NIOSH to see if there are exposure routes that hadn't previously been considered. They're working very hard on the primary exposure route from AFFF, and I know that's a great study they're engaged in. So I'll let those guys take over then.
Well, and before Dr. Burgess and Dr. Calkins jump in, you said a couple of things that are really important, and a lot of folks listen to this, and a lot of folks come to FDIC and read my publication. I intend to do an editorial based upon this conversation and get some points out there. So your opinion, Dr. Peaslee, is that we should be limiting our exposure to our gear until we know more, which I think is a reasonable thing to ask of people. And I'll ask Dr. Burgess and Dr. Calkins to opine also. But and again, albeit with the best of intentions, I run a stair climbs and at FDIC, and men and women will show up in their gear to do these climbs. I do a fun run, and men and women, and we applaud them because they are paying homage to the folks who climbed in gear. But the folks who climbed in gear were going to face a fire. So we should discourage our brothers and sisters from wearing their gear at those events to limit exposure. I heard that loud and clear.
Well, I think that's a suggestion. Of course, you want the badge. I mean, you guys are doing the fire services because that is a symbol of what the firefighter is, and I don't want to detract from that. And, you know, doing the fun run with the gear on in support of your brothers that died, you know, nobody's going to discredit that. But I think that if you think about, like you said, you keep the old uniforms and your kids have taken it out for Halloween, maybe not, until we know more about it, for example. I know the old uniforms have lots of PFOA in them. And so I would suggest.
And I'm hearing you loud and clear. I'm not, in no way am I, I've been accused of being the cheerleader for the fire service, and it's a badge I wear proudly. I am the American Fire Service cheerleader. I'm on the sidelines. I think there is no greater institution, as Kurt Vonnegut put it, that represents man's humanity to man than the American Fire Service, bar none. And I'll go to the mat with anybody about, I don't care if you're the World Health Organization or whoever you are. We're fighting a war that never ends, to quote Ernie DiMaria, every day on the front line against physics, chemistry, stupidity, you name it, we're out there. And anything I can do or any message I can send that's going to get the men and women who I love more than anything else in the world home at the end of the day, I'm going to tell them. And so there's other ways we can do it. Back in the day, and I'll throw this out for you, maybe we should be doing, back in the day, and I've got all the fire engineering since, I got Fire Magazine since the 1860s, and Fire Engineering's been around since 1877. And when you used to compliment a firefighter, the compliment used to be, he's the best man in corduroy and blue jeans, because that's what we wore. Now, I don't know how toxic, I hope blue jeans aren't toxic, because it's all I wear. And someday we probably will find out it makes you stupid. But it's a mechanic's uniform. I'm a mechanic by choice, but I'm a bad one. So I had to become a firefighter. So the point is that there's other ways we could pay homage. We could wear our job jackets. We could wear all kinds of stuff that's not possibly infecting the very people we love the most with a chemical compound that could hurt them, whether it's long chain Cs or PFOAs or whatever else it is. I mean, so thank you for saying that. And I'm going to share that information with my friends at the National Fallen Firefighters and everybody else who does a stair climb to say, look, we get it. We get that you want to pay homage. Wear your duty jacket, wear your job coat, because they're all corduroy and blue jean. That's just a blue jean jacket, and they're heavy as hell. Yep. And so you're not, and carry an air pack if you want, a clean one.
Clean one.
Yeah, a clean one. So, Dr. Burgess, if you wouldn't mind chiming in on the medical side about what we know and don't know, and just because Nassim Taleb once said, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And so, and I agree with that. Just because you can't draw a straight line between this chemical and this cancer doesn't mean that someday we won't be able to do that. The whole black swan idea that Taleb has so eloquently put out there. And I think that one line illuminates that book. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So just because we can't draw a line right now between this cancer or that cancer, it's not a good idea to load your body up with things that nature, God didn't create, in my opinion. So, Doc, about the biology of these things.
So let me talk a little bit about what we know about toxicity and what we're doing to find out more. And then Miriam can discuss some of the ways that we're evaluating for the exposure side. Because I think it's important to both know how much exposure occurs from different sources and routes, and obviously what that does in your body. One thing that we have found so far, looking at what is actually within the body and comparing firefighters within the Firefighter Cancer Cohort study from different parts of the country, and comparing that to the national population, is that there are certain chemicals that are up more than the general population in some firefighters, but not all. And again, we haven't published that yet. We're working towards it. But one of the primary ones is one of the chemicals called PFHXS. And I think Graham already mentioned that, but that's one. And then The other one that tends to be up are different types of PFOS. We haven't really seen the PFOA being up. That's kind of the granddaddy, if you will, and Graham had mentioned that a few times. But again, you realize that we were looking at just 4 fire departments in different geographic parts of the US. That's not all the fire departments, so things may be different in different locations, and I think we have to remember that. But therefore, you know, I can talk about chemicals in general, but as Graham had mentioned, there's many different PFOS chemicals, and you have to realize that we don't know a lot about most of them, and we only know a little bit about some of them. So from the perspective of what we know the most about, we know the most about PFOA. Again, that's not up in the firefighters in our study so far, but we know that that's associated with different types of cancer, and we know that it has a number of other effects, reproductive effects, immunologic effects. It seems to have many, many different type of manifestations. We are worried for the PFOS and the PFHXS, whether it might have an increased risk of cancer for certain individuals. For example, there are some studies out there, not in firefighters, but in the general population, where they're comparing people with prostate cancer and those without and measuring the levels of these chemicals in their bodies, that if you have an elevated concentration of PFHXS, for example, and you have a primary relative like a father or a brother that has prostate cancer, that you may have an increased risk. So not for everybody, but if you have an increased risk of prostate cancer, the PFHXS may lead you to have an increased risk. So again, just one more time, because that's kind of an important concept. If you don't have a increased concentration of PFHXS, does not increase your risk of prostate cancer. But if you have a primary relative that has it, then it does. So that's kind of what we know so far for the main chemicals. Realize also, again, as Graham had said, that there's many, many different PFOS chemicals. And these shorter ones that he's been talking about aren't measured generally by the CDC in their standard package, and that's what we're using. So we in the future are going to be looking at using what we call non-targeted mechanisms to look at many different PFOS chemicals, in addition to those that we've been looking at so far, like PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS. And then the final thing, and because I know I've been talking for a long time here now, is that we're starting to look at some measures of toxicity by doing a couple different things. One, we're looking at these different PFAS chemical levels in association with these epigenetic markers I mentioned before. So that's ongoing work. And we're actually using cells, both human cells and other type of cells, and putting some of these AFFF foam products, the fluorinated ones, on these cells and seeing what they do. And I would say that, you know, that's going to help us move forward to understand a little bit more about what individual chemicals and chemical mixtures can do. But it's, again, just some first steps.
So, Doc, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you just a couple of quick questions you said there. And full disclosure, my old man had prostate cancer. I have prostate cancer, so my kids are screwed if they decide to be firefighters. I heard that loud and clear.
Well, Bobby, I would only say that, again, if they have an increased level of, you know, some of these PFOS chemicals in them. So that wasn't true for all fire departments, just some. And we don't know where that increase is coming from yet. We don't know if it's a geographic thing regionally or if it's from work. That's some of the things that we're trying to work on now.
But one of the points that you raised, and I think it's important for me anyway, is that we probably need to really get better medical histories from our people up front when we're hiring them, so that men and women like you can use that for your studies going forward into the future. In other words, you would have that data, because now with the great work that we're doing with N4s and other data collection systems, you could access that more readily. Does that make sense?
It does, and that's part of our firefighter cancer cohort study is collecting that information. So at the University of Miami, under the direction of Dr. Alberto Cavan Martinez, he's collecting all this survey data. We ask about, have you had any family member with a history of cancer? And if so, what type of cancer it was? So we collect that information. We add that to the exposure information that Miriam and her other colleagues at NIOSH are collecting as part of this. And then we look at some of the epigenetic changes and other things we can do with stored biological samples at the University of Arizona. And we're putting all those together, which is what really makes the combination so powerful. And realize also that we have a fire service oversight, and that's been run by Casey Grant, who I think many of you know, a fantastic person. So we're doing this with the agreement and under the oversight of the fire service.
No, we are well aware that you're working for us day and night, all three of you, but doing a Herculean task. Miriam, if you'd like to, we've got about 5 minutes left, and Miriam, I'd love to bring you in, and please, if you wouldn't mind, touch on the registry, which I know you and Kenny are working on diligently, which should be up hopefully next year sometime, correct?
I think yes. So I will mention I'm not a part of the registry team. There's another Miriam Siegel. So we often get confused, but she's part of the registry team. And I mean, our offices are all right around each other. So we do work very closely. But yes, the firefighter registry is moving forward, led by Dr. Kenny Fent. We're hopeful that it will be up and running and people can start enrolling about a year from now, but I know there may be delays in part because I think everyone's time has currently been redirected to COVID-19 response right now. So stay tuned for that, but there should be, I believe, a protocol available for public comment in the very near future. So keep an eye out for that on the Federal Registry. And the one quick plug I'll give for that is that it's the registry is for everybody. All firefighters, I should say. It's not just for firefighters who have cancer, it's for every firefighter. And actually, we encourage people who do not have a cancer diagnosis to consider enrolling because then we get more information from you before you potentially do get that diagnosis. And I think the last thing you want to do when you're battling that diagnosis and looking at treatment options is considering spending some time signing up for a NIOSH registry. So please consider that ahead of time and keep an eye out for that in the future. But some of the PFAS exposure work that we're doing, which Jeff did give a quick intro to, and also some of Graham's work is also, it's very important for, but we understand that there's PFAS in products, right? And we're doing a lot of work to understand how much and what kinds and where are they and how has it changed over the years. And then we know that firefighters have PFAS in their bodies. And there's been a number of studies that have demonstrated that firefighters in various different geographic locations and also from various different types of firefighting, so specifically airport firefighters, have levels of PFAS, certain PFAS, not all, that are elevated or just higher than the general population. So compared to, let's say, the US population as a whole. But how those two connect is where there's a lot of information missing. There's information missing in not only the route of exposure, which is how that chemical gets from the outside to inside the body. So are people breathing it in? Is it being absorbed to the skin? Are they ingesting it? A lot of the research into PFAS in the community exposures have really focused on the oral route, so drinking or eating. But for occupational environments, that's typically not the exposure route that we're mostly concerned with. I would hope you're not eating things at your work that are going to expose you to this. But there may be some inadvertent ingestion. So the research in the other routes is pretty limited. And particularly for dermal, there's not a lot of information about how your skin absorbs this compound or this set of compounds. But there is research that's coming out soon, and there is some that demonstrates that it can pass through the skin. Just to what extent and which compounds we still don't really know. And then additionally, how much are you exposed to from these different potential sources? So you may have exposure to the foam, you may have exposure from your turnout gear, and then the other one that we're considering looking into, but there's very little information, is live fire response. So if you think about our homes and our buildings, there's PFAS in not only the building materials, but everything that we put in our homes, everything from probably the makeup that I'm wearing right now to the carpet and stain-resistant coatings on that to the walls potentially. And so when that goes up in flames, how much is being released, and is it available for firefighters, and is it maybe getting on their turnout gear, on their skin, and being, you know, tracked back if there's not proper decon and cleaning and hygiene afterwards. So trying to connect the fact that we know it's in the environment and we know it's in firefighters, and how is that happening is really what we're going forward with the firefighter cancer cohort study work with PFAS. And it's a pretty small sample that we'll be doing a more detailed assessment on, but we'll be trying to collect biological measures as well as some environmental measures from firefighters in somewhat isolated environments, and then comparing them across the students. So I think I just used up our time. But.
Great. So I'm going to get to Dr. Graham in a moment, but just to dovetail off what Miriam just shared, I paid attention during your lecture. I've watched you several times. And one of the things she pointed out is the folks that apply ski wax are, other than the folks that make it, they're the second highest group. So this stuff is everywhere. You know, unfortunately, I believe it was Seneca who said that generations from now, our descendants will be amazed at the things that are so obvious to them that we don't know. And I think obviously, you know, the incredible pollution, if you will, of our environment will be one of those things that we just naively blundered into. And anything we can do at this time to make our environment less toxic, I applaud you for. Please keep your eye on the CDC, support the CDC efforts towards the fire service, and Dr. Fent, all the CDC folks, we have half a dozen of you were scheduled for FDIC, which we're rescheduling, and you will be at every show we do for the unforeseeable future. So thank you to everybody at the CDC. Dr. Peaslee, if I could bring you in real quickly for some closing remarks. I had a couple of questions for you that I think are important. You said to keep ourselves away from the gear as much as possible. Oftentimes we take old gear and we send it to Ecuador, we send it to wherever, or we send it to Appalachia. Probably not a good idea. And then, okay, full disclosure, I was an environmentalist back I still am. I'm a huge environmentalist, and I have no shame about it. I bought a Jeep in 1971 or 2 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, without air conditioning because of the air conditioning pollutants. And Alan Brunacini beat me up on it every day for 35 years because I took him on a drive in a brand new Jeep without air conditioning. And he said, "You live in Albuquerque, you idiot." but I wanted to limit my family and myself's exposure to those chemicals, and which turned out to be terrible chemicals. Mm-hmm. So anyway, getting rid of the gear, I know that's a huge controversial issue, but we have to address it. It's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. So if you wouldn't mind talking a bit about that, talking a bit about what we could do, and if there's any research that you're applying for or any way that the fire service can help promote the work that you're doing, our gratitude to you as well as everyone on here. But please.
Sure, Bobby. I think the real bottom line is that nothing's going to change overnight, and nothing is being advised to change overnight. It's going to take a while to change a battleship's direction. It really will. I think the fire services in the military have had more exposure to AFFF. I think those municipals have less. Everybody's wearing gear. And so the question is, we don't know enough about it. And there will be a good NIOSH study coming out on it, and there will be lots more information in a few years. In the meanwhile, the precautionary principle is just use as less we saw transfer from the gear to our hands, and that means we should be careful with that. And I don't know if it's getting inside, but we don't really want to find that out. And I don't know what happens when it gets inside. It's a very complicated issue. There's thousands of different compounds and thousands of different pathways. Does it suppress the immune system? That would be a way for any opportunistic disease or genetic disorder to take over if you're genetically predisposed. I mean, this is just really complicated. It's not easy to understand, even for scientists. So I think that what we take away from it is that treat the gear with respect. Just remember that it's there to protect you, and it's also filled with some chemicals, some of which are known to be hazardous. Does that mean you shouldn't eat your gear? I guess most of us know that. But are there other things we can do in certain situations. All my suggestions have come from firefighters who said, look, we don't wear it on a run that doesn't have a fire involved, but we keep it in the cab in case it becomes a fire situation. And one of the firefighters just volunteered, do you think we should clean that box out? It's got an inch of dust on the bottom of it. It contains all our gear. It's like, probably a good idea. I mean, those are the types of in the field suggestions that I think firefighters can, it's really powerful to know that you can control something. So we'll let the industries decide what's safe and unsafe eventually. They don't want to change things. It's not industry's fault. It's these chemicals were never designed for the way of the chemistry that we're doing. So I think that we are going to eventually affect change. I think that firefighters being aware of it will help. I think funding agencies funding the type of work that Jeff and Miriam are doing is incredibly important. This is just, I'm a measurement person. I do measurements. I got the wonderful firefighter friends already. That's enough for me. I think that what they do is they need the funding to be able to do this on a large, what they call cohorts, large groups of people, so it's statistically significant. And once you get thousands of firefighters involved and you realize, wow, we should really be wearing our CVA, you kind of already know that, Bobby, but that's the type of message we need to get out to all the inactive fire services now. And thank you for the opportunity to say it.
No, and I appreciate it. And I've long struggled with our use of our gear. It's cold out, so we put our gear on. That's not a good idea. And also, your gear degrades in sunlight, so you're reducing some of the things it's designed to do, the thermal protective qualities that it has. And so, you're beating up your gear unnecessarily. That's supposed to protect your life in these, life or death situations. So there's a lot of great reasons to, do less in our gear other than in the military. It's called battle rattle. It's called putting your plates on. You're going outside the wire, so you put your plates on, which are these 12-pound plates in your front and back, and they're designed to stop most bullets. So you put on your battle rattle only when you're going downrange where you're going to get shot at. We ought to treat our gear like battle rattle. You put it on where you're going to go into a fire. Not for car accidents, not for EMS calls, not because it's cold out, and not to, no disrespect, but not to pay homage to anyone or run in a race or do a stair climb. I think we got to get that message out more forcefully, and it's not, I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm just saying that we now know that there are materials in there which we currently need or want to some extent, and until we find an adequate replacement, like corduroy or blue jeans, if that's what it is, then let's be aware of it. Dr. Burgess, why don't you bring it home for us and we'll wrap this up.
Sure. I think all the work that Graham is doing and Miriam is doing is really important. There's other folks that are working on this important topic in many different parts of the country and the world, as was mentioned. So I think that, we are, as Graham had said, moving forward, we will be getting more information. I mean, we know that I think what the main point of our discussion today has been the fact that we know that these materials are in the gear. We don't know the extent to which they're getting inside the body of the firefighter. They are help those effects might be. So I think it's good to have a precautionary principle, but I think it's also important to realize that we're at a stage where we don't have all the answers, but we're working towards it. And so I know it's hard to be kind of patient in this particular setting, and I think people should take common sense actions, as has been described. But I think we do need additional answers before we can truly decide how best to move forward. And then one other thing I would just like to finish with too is, although we know these PFOS chemicals aren't good for you, we have to be careful if we're going to replace them with something else that we know the toxicity of those chemicals that might be used to replace them. So just be thinking about that as we move forward.
It's the old adage, the old Irish adage, the devil you know is sometimes better than the devil you don't. So I totally understand. I'd like to thank all of my guests. We ran a tad long. I apologize. They have really important duties to attend to currently with this pandemic outbreak. So I couldn't be more grateful for you giving us your time and your energy. I hope that you and your families are safe. And thank you so much for joining us on the National Firefighters podcast. We're so grateful for having you on with us today, and we're so grateful for the work you've done And I know we'll be seeing you all at FDIC and other conferences in the future. And if there's anything we can do to help you with your work at any time, please don't hesitate to call on us. So this has been the National Fireman's Journal podcast, and our guests today, Dr. Calkins, Dr. Peaslee, Dr. Burgess. Thank you all for your time, and we'll see you down the road sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby.